Good afternoon and welcome to this very timely discussion of the Biden agenda. I'm Russ Austin, Associate Vice Chancellor for Plan Giving, and I'll be your moderator today. It's wonderful to have so many Elliott Society members and Brookings partners join us for what promises to be a very engaging, informed, and spirited discussion of the economic, social, and political impact of President Biden's proposed agenda. We'd like to extend a special thank you to Elliott Society members and Brookings partners for your commitment to advancing the mission of Washington University through your support. Our format today will be 5 themes for our 3 panelists to discuss. In addition, should we have time, we will address some of the questions that were submitted in advance of this program. I'd like to highlight that while the topics our panelists are addressing are subject to many varying viewpoints, the purpose of today's webinar is to provide analysis and insights into the issues. Washington University is not advocating any political or social positions, ideas, or agendas. I would also like to let you know that we are recording the program, and as a reminder, we'd appreciate if everyone would mute their microphones for the duration of the program. Due to the wonderful turnout for this webinar, we won't be taking live questions. However, as I mentioned before, many of you sent questions with your registration, and we will get to as many of those as time allows. Last, should you have any technical difficulties, please email elliottssociety@wustl.edu. That's elliottssociety@wustl.edu. It is now my pleasure to introduce our distinguished panel. Professor Stephen Fazzari is the Bert A. and Jeanette L. Lynch Distinguished Professor of Economics, Professor of Sociology, and Director of the Weidenbaum Center on the Economy, Government, and Public Policy. He has been on faculty at Washington University in St. Louis for 40 years. Professor Fazzari's research explores the sources of economic growth and cause of U.S. business cycles. Dr. Larry Meyer is president of Monetary Policy Analytics, Inc. Dr. Meyer served as a governor on the Federal Reserve Board from June 1996 through January 2002. In this role, he became widely known as an influential member of the Federal Open Market Committee and built a reputation for independent thinking and straight talk about monetary policy. Before joining the board, Dr. Meyer was also a professor of economics and a former chair of the Department of Economics at Washington University, where he taught for 27 years. Our final panelist, Professor Stephen Smith, is the Kate M. Gregg Professor of Social Sciences and Professor of Political Science at Washington University. He directed the Weidenbaum Center at Washington University for 20 years and has been on the faculty of the University of Minnesota, George Washington University, Northwestern University, and was a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. We are thrilled to have these 3 distinguished panelists for our discussion today. Professor Fazzari, Dr. Meyer, and Professor Smith, thank you for joining us. With that, let's start with our first topic. The first topic, 2 infrastructure packages are moving through Congress, the $1.2 trillion traditional infrastructure plan and the $3.2 trillion social policy plan. There are many claims out there that this spending is excessive or unprecedented. We'll start with Professor Fazzari. Historically, how do you assess the size of these plans?
Well, thanks, Russ. Thanks for the nice introduction. And very pleased to be here. It's a wonderful turnout from our Elliott Society members, our Weidenbaum Society members, and the Washington University community in general. Great to be part of this discussion. So yeah, there were these discussions about trillions and trillions of dollars. It reminds me that maybe your chemistry professor, your physics professor back in high school taught you about scientific notation and how you had to do powers of 10. The numbers are just so huge. How do you really assess these things? And I think some of this has been a bit exaggerated. So I'm going to show you a little a graphic that I actually have stolen from the Washington Post. I think it's actually quite helpful to see what's going on. So they did a pretty good job already. This was the first chart that they showed, reconciliation in historical perspective, spending per person. So they adjust for the population and also adjust for inflation. And here's where you get this kind of unprecedented sense. You can see here's the New Deal, there it is. Here's the Great Society and the Johnson administration. Medicare and Medicaid in particular. The Obama programs look even bigger. Affordable Care Act here, plus the response to the Great Recession. And then you see these Biden plans, the American Rescue Plan, which is already winding down, but especially the infrastructure in this place and the reconciliation bill. And it looks so much bigger. And this is unprecedented, really huge. But if you do it this way, which I think is much more appropriate, you're talking about this relative to the size of the economy. And the economy has grown quite substantially over these many decades. And now you see the scales look quite a bit different, with the New Deal being pretty much the biggest, except for a little spike right here around the pandemic. And with the Biden agenda being maybe on roughly the same scale, maybe a bit bigger than the Great Society or the Obama programs. But I want to make one additional point, which is this is the 10-year horizon that the Congressional Budget Office uses to assess these policies. And that's where you get this number, 3.5 trillion. But if you're thinking about the longer term trends, there's another difference here. You notice how this is dropping off pretty significantly. It's maybe about 1.8, 1.9% of the economy, and then dropping below 1% in 10 years. And here you don't really see what's going on, but the Social Security back here in the New Deal, Medicare, Medicaid, Obamacare, all these things are expanding. And whereas a lot of what's in the Biden agenda are not likely to grow that quickly over the long term. I did a quick calculation, and I would say only about 20%, a little over 20% of the reconciliation bill, the big part that's generated the most controversy, would be in this healthcare or aging sector, the kinds of things that tend to grow much faster than the economy. So if you're looking at this over decade-long horizon, this is likely going to be a much smaller impact. And so some of the rhetoric around this area, I think is excessive.
Great. Steve or Larry, do you have anything to add to that?
Larry, you're muted.
In terms of thinking about the impact on the economy of these spending programs, you have to ask how much of that is offset by taxes. And the stimulus is really spending relative to tax revenue. Now, to the extent that most of these programs are partly or fully offset by taxes, the impact on the economy is going to be a lot less.
Yeah, the only thing I'd add is that even the, Russ, what you call the traditional infrastructure bill is non-traditional in many respects. For example, if we think the traditional infrastructure bill is roads and bridges, water and sewer, there's so much more in this first bill than that, and that's why it's drawn so much support. For example, the huge investment in broadband to hard-to-serve areas, a massive federal infusion of money to buy electric vehicles for public transport, a sizable addition to the Superfund for environmental cleanup. So they're moving in directions that you probably wouldn't consider to be traditional, but now have received bipartisan support. So if that first smaller bill gets passed, it's moving the federal government in important directions.
Great, thank you. Second question, and this we'll start with Dr. Meyer. What impact could the passage of one or both of the plans have on the economy, the fight against climate change, and the well-being on future generations?
In assessing this plan, the economic effects are side effects of the program. They're not the motivation of the program. It's not the metric by which you decide whether you like it or not, okay? It's about unmet social needs, it's about climate, it's about income inequality. So I think in that respect, these programs will make a big difference to quality of life, equality of opportunity, narrowing income inequality. All these things are good. If you like that, you like the program. If you don't like that, you don't like the program. And of course, climate change is existential. There's nothing in here that's more important than what's being done with respect to climate change. And of course, if that doesn't happen, then we don't have to talk about the economy.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I like that perspective that the economic impact here is probably secondary. It's really about what Larry and Steve Smith in the previous comment were talking about. What's in this package? Is this useful for the economy? That said, or I should say, is this useful for the society? But then I'm an economist, so I'm going to go to the economic side here a little bit and say, well, there is some stimulus in the bill. Larry makes the point, a good point about it depends on how much the spending is offset with taxes, but it also depends on who those taxes are on. And there's a lot of complication there. I would say overall, just kind of stepping back from the details, that if this goes through, there will be some economic stimulus here. Many people would argue we don't need that, right now we're in a situation where we're recovering pretty fast from the pandemic. There was a lot of short-term stimulus pumped into the economy over the last 18 months or so since the beginning of the pandemic. However, if you look back a little bit further and remember that this is a more of a long-term program, these are things that are not going to just be a matter of a year or two, that prior to the pandemic, I don't think the US economy was doing all that great. In fact, I just saw some research today on a particular measure of consumption I've been working on with a young co-author who was a former Washington University student, where we show that the economy really hadn't caught up to the trend it had before the Great Recession. And so there was a lot of discussion about growth being mediocre. There was a lot of debate around the elections, presidential elections on this issue. But if you go back, the growth wasn't particularly good between 2007 and the beginning of the pandemic. And so that I think the economy could actually benefit from some longer term support that this might provide. And that's more that kind of demand side perspective, but also the kinds of things that are in the bill, as Steve and Larry were talking about infrastructure, about energy policy, things like that, family support too, and how it could affect the labor market, that these things actually could also provide some what we would call supply side growth in this perspective. And so I think, there's going to be some debates, and I know we're going to be talking about tax policy and some of the negatives here, but there are some positives, and it's a kind of a judgment call in terms of which one dominates.
Well, let me make a point here. I thought that before the pandemic, we were in macroeconomic heaven. The unemployment rate was 3.5%. Inflation was barely 2%. Now up growth, long run growth, that's very hard to change, okay? It's much lower than it used to be, but unrelated to the kind of policies that we're talking about. And in terms of what the agenda would do, there are positive and negative effects. Physical infrastructure, positive. Marginal tax rates, negative. So when you look at the simulations, whether you believe them or not, from a variety of groups, many of them say the net effect will be negative, okay? That's not going to change whether you like the program or not.
Yeah, I guess it goes back to that issue, which is that are these things important? Probably the macroeconomic effects are really secondary. Sorry, go ahead, Steve.
Well, I was going to say, certainly that we'd want to take them into account, but Murray Wiedenbaum used to say almost every day, we can spend more money, but you want to spend it on the right things. You want to invest on things that have payoffs in the future. And I think there are some elements in here that, especially in the area of education and in some technology areas that'll improve economic efficiency, where the payoffs will be very long, and the spending is so new that we'd have a very difficult time estimating what the economic consequences would be. So what are the economic consequences of over 20% of the spending of this $3.5 trillion plan? Now it's not going to be that large in the end. Is in the area of education. So it's in community college funding. It's in pre-K and childcare. It's in expanding Pell Grants, so more students can afford college. Those have very positive long-term effects on the economy, I assume, even though they cost a lot of money in the short run. And so one of the interesting things here is that even the partisans on Capitol Hill are not really fighting about the economic consequences so much. They're really fighting about expanding the role of government in American society. And this represents a major expansion of the role of government in American society. That's for sure. But they're not, as Larry suggests, they're not really fighting over the economic consequences themselves.
Great, thank you. Thank you to all three of you. Next question is a little bit about the politics. So, clearly the politics of getting these plans through Congress are challenging for the Biden administration. It seemed like there was bipartisan support for the smaller package focused on the traditional infrastructure, but even that proposal has bogged down. Professor Smith, can you help us understand the political dynamics that will shape the outcome? And do you think one or both of the plans will pass?
Well, I think they both will pass, but it's not going to be easy. We're kind of in the same situation that we were in 2009, where we were wondering whether Obamacare would pass. We saw that there were a couple of holdouts. Senator Lieberman didn't like the public option. There were changes to Medicaid that other Democrats didn't want. And it looked, even as we approached November, that they were 1 or 2 or 3 votes short of the 60 necessary to invoke cloture and get the bill moving forward. And they're kind of in that position now. But what's amazing is that the Democrats actually are very close. They're probably even closer than they were on Obamacare at this particular moment in the process. Whether they can get over the hump, sure, I think they can, and I think they will. It'll be something much smaller than 3.5, probably closer to 2. But it'll still be a substantial victory in the eyes of most Democrats. I think part of the problem here is President Biden's eagerness to have a bipartisan package early in the process. When some Republicans said, yeah, we'd go for a small physical infrastructure bill, he said, sure, let's pass what we can. That was he was just so tempted to have something bipartisan and to have it quick. But that meant that his overall plan, his big jobs plan and his big family plan would be carved up in a way that he did not anticipate. And I think he lost the framing of the issue. So we've been talking about 3.5 trillion instead of a family plan. And as Larry and Steve have suggested, maybe even me, there's a lot of substantive policy proposals here. And I think the president's kind of lost the framing game, which I think he and the Democrats will try hard to regain over the next few weeks.
I'm going to nudge Steve here a little bit on this too, because I think it can be a bit confusing. So this is all through reconciliation. And so we have the filibuster in the Senate, but we can pass this with 50 votes. If the Democrats can get Manchin and Sinema on board, then it seems like it's probably going to go through. So I wonder, Steve, if you could comment a bit about the reconciliation aspect of this and,
Sure.
and kind of why we're in that spot.
Well, as everyone knows, we've got a budget process, and the Budget Act of 1974 sets up a process called reconciliation that since 1980 has been used in a way never anticipated just a few years earlier. So it's a way of passing a budget-related policy under the rubric of a budget reconciliation bill. The Republicans did this in a big way back in 2001 and 2003 when they passed tax cuts using reconciliation. And in 2010, they passed the last parts of Obamacare under reconciliation, and the Democrats are now doing it for a new big spending plan.
Excuse me, Steve, didn't the Trump tax cuts also go through with reconciliation?
They did indeed.
Yeah.
And so the using reconciliation isn't too unusual. What's unusual is for you, in this case, is the big spending part of it. The unfortunate thing for the Democrats is that reconciliation comes with a bunch of procedural constraints, limits on what can be included. And they're still struggling under what those restraints allow them to do. But the key thing is that you can't use reconciliation for spending more than once a fiscal year, and they're using it for this.
Professor Smith, Oh, go ahead, Steve.
I was going to say, if they keep the infrastructure bill and the broader social spending package, as it's called, separate, can they both be done with reconciliation in one shot? Is that the way it would work, or do they have to get the Republicans on board for at least one of them?
Well, they could have, but they passed the smaller one as a regular bill, not as a reconciliation bill. And the House is holding up action on that smaller one because progressives, Democrats in the House, don't want to act on the smaller one until there's agreement on the larger package under reconciliation. So it's one regular bill, that's the small one reconciliation bill, that's the larger one, and they're politically connected.
Thank you.
Professor Smith, what could be the fallout in the midterm elections if both bills pass, or if neither one passes?
Well, the midterm elections are a bit of a struggle for the Democrats no matter what. I mean, it's the midterm of their president's first term, and that's usually not a very good election year for the president's party. In the House, there are only, the division right now is 222 Democrats to 213 Republicans. A majority is 218. So if, the Democrats lose as many as just 5 seats out of 222 that they currently hold, they lose their House majority. As everyone in the world knows, it's a 50-50 tie in the Senate right now. And so that could easily flip. In the House, of course, everyone's up for re-election. 5 seats is kind of the margin of error in election outcomes for the House. So, you'd almost expect that the House will go Republican. The Senate's a little bit different because only a third of its seats are up for re-election each year. But this coming year is a bad year for the Republicans. Of the 34 seats that are up for re-election, 22 are currently held by Republicans. And 5 Republicans, including Missouri's own Roy Blunt, have indicated that they plan to retire. So the Republicans kind of have an uphill climb there, even though a midterm is a good time for the out party. So if you were betting, you might say the Democrats have maybe a slight edge in keeping the Senate, but the Republicans have a slight edge in winning the House. Now, what will happen? Will these events affect those outcomes? Well, sure they will. But exactly how, I'm not sure. So far, the president's bills seem reasonably popular. They've lost popularity as this whole process is dragged on. And that's one reason the president would like to see closure. And of course, what affects the outcome more than anything is the president's popularity. So if this ends up in a failure and more of a legislative catastrophe, especially with the debt limit and appropriations bills coming to a head in December, we could be entering an election year with things looking pretty bad for Biden and therefore for the congressional Democrats.
Great, thank you. The fiscal infrastructure plan includes an increase in taxes for corporations and citizens. What taxes do you think will be included in the final package, and what impact could these taxes have?
So one of us should talk. I think Larry probably has the better perspective on this, but I'll start. So, what will be included in the final package? I suppose this is subject to negotiation. I don't know that anybody knows the answer to that in some sense, but what's out there, what was in the initial package, is an increase in the corporate tax rate from 21% to 26%. I believe that's down from 35, if I've got that right. It was 35 before the Trump tax cuts, and now it's kind of clawing back part of that, but not all of that reduction. An increase in the top personal rate. This has been bouncing around for the past several decades. So it's now 37%. They want to move it back to 39.6%, which is where it had been under various Democratic presidents, and an increase in the top capital gains rate from 20% to 25%. So there's lots of changes. We've seen lots of changes in past decades. I will defer to Larry here, but to the extent that I've looked at the evidence on these kinds of things, there's not much strong evidence that these things have major effects on the economy, at least in this magnitude. All these are fairly modest changes. Like I said, the corporate tax rate is probably the biggest in terms of percentage changes, or the capital gains rate. But we've seen these things go up and down over my 40 years that you mentioned earlier on, Russ, at Washington University. And economic performance has not been very closely correlated with these tax changes. I think a more effective way to study these things is more with microeconomic evidence, to try to look at things like business investment with firm levels and how that relates to taxes. And there's some debate there. I actually have a bit of a horse in that race, in the sense I've done some research in this area with co-authors over the years, and we find reasonably small effects in this context. So my sense is that it's not going to be a real big effect. I think Larry mentioned earlier that he saw the tax increases as a negative. I won't disagree with that, but it suggests that if it is a negative, it'll be a small one.
I agree with that. I think that these tax changes are controversial within the Democratic Party. There are members of that party that don't want to see any increase in corporate tax rates. Another feature of this program is a minimum tax of 15% on corporations. It's amazing how many large corporations don't pay any taxes. So that's an important part of it. The increase in marginal rates for high income, that's definitely going to be part of the program. But for example, raising the tax on capital gains, that's very controversial within. There are, I was just thinking of other things. Narrowing wealth inequality. Very important there is estate taxes. It's very controversial. Increasing estate taxes on high wealth individuals, very important. And limiting the step up in basis, where you don't count your property at its current value, you count it at what it was when you bought it, maybe 40 years ago. So that's a way of escaping taxes on your current wealth. That's controversial. So we'll see what happens.
I will say that a big part of the discussion around taxes, and even in the major topic in a number of elections, certainly the recent 2020 election, is this issue of income and wealth inequality. And I think a pretty strong sense, defer again to my other colleague, Steve Smith, on this one, but in the political data, the polling data, that most Americans, a large majority of Americans, do actually favor a somewhat more progressive tax system. And all these changes move in that direction. I think things like the capital gains tax rate and even to some extent the corporate tax rate certainly could apply, further down. It could be that somebody of modest means owns, has a little bit of a stock portfolio or things along those lines. But the vast majority of these taxes are going to be focused on the top 1%, maybe the top 2% of the economy. I think Biden's largely going to be credible on the argument that these tax changes will have small, maybe zero effects below something like $400,000 in income, which probably puts you in the top 2%. And most of it would probably be in the top 1% or top 1/10 of 1%.
You have to remember that one of the major motivations of this program is to reduce income and wealth inequality. So these tax programs are all moving in that direction. Not all of them will get through, but some will.
Yeah, and in particular, if you kind of put the taxes together with the spending programs, where you see things like some education subsidies, childcare subsidies, other kinds of things, long-term care for the elderly, an expansion of Medicare benefits for dental and hearing. Now, you could be very wealthy and still get a Medicare reimbursement on for your hearing aid, but at least the relative impact of this social side of this on the spending is going to be broadly distributed across the economy, whereas the taxes are really going to be quite narrowly distributed. So it does meet that objective of leading to a more equal sense, both on the spending side and the tax when you put them together.
Agreed.
The political side of taxes is that it's moderate Democrats in both the House and the Senate, Manchin and Sinema kind of most well known on this. Their main concerns are about the size of the tax increases. There are very few spending items in the president's plan that they've objected to, but they certainly don't like the tax increases. So to get their support and the support of some moderate House Democrats will require adjustment on the tax plans, reducing the size of the tax cuts. And so if you want this larger plan to be paid for, that means shrinking on the spending side. And it's on that side at this moment where liberal Democrats in Congress are scrambling to figure out, well, okay, if we have to pare this from 3.5 trillion to say 2.3 or something in that neighborhood, how do we do that? Notice there's not a lot of talk about what they're going to do on the tax side. They just simply assume they're going to have more modest tax hikes. They're struggling to figure out whether they want to favor the expansion of Medicare coverage and benefit seniors or benefit community college students. And those are the kinds of constituency politics that are going on and will continue to go on over the next few weeks.
Professor Smith, do you think the bills either get passed before the end of the year, or they won't, and it'll be dead if it goes into next year?
Well, certainly it's not dead if it goes into the next year. It will just go into the second session of this Congress. I think the Democrats would very much like to go home over the holidays with major legislative successes. Remember when they put things off just a couple of weeks ago, the speaker hoped to get this done by the end of October. No one's really talking that way now. More likely Thanksgiving.
Great, thank you. We're seeing a prices rise and a shortage of supply in multiple markets. In addition, there is an unusually large number of job vacancies in the economy, and businesses are concerned about their inability to hire qualified workers. Do you think the passage of the Biden agenda will raise inflation even further, and how will it affect the labor market?
Well, I like to suggest this sort of dialogue. A reporter says to Janet Yellen, your program is going to lead to higher inflation. And she says, no, if there's higher inflation, blame the Fed. That's the Fed's mandate. That's the Fed's mandate. They have to take into account whatever the government does and whether that will lead to inflation or otherwise unwelcome results and offset it. That's their job. So the Biden administration is not going to have a big impact on that, in part to the degree it's financed by taxes and because ultimately it's about monetary policy. But inflation is the big unexpected story this year. Growth is strong, unemployment rate is falling. Inflation is the highest it's been since the early 90s. And the reason is some of what you suggested, Russ. There are two sources of inflation in the near term: aggregate demand relative to aggregate supply. Okay, that's not the story here. The story is supply shocks. Anything other than that is a supply shock. What do we have? Supply chain constraints. Now, cars need semiconductors. Semiconductors are produced in Japan. No semiconductors from Japan, no auto production in the US. Very simple. Motor vehicle prices have gone up at a 29% rate this year, an example. But it's much broader than that. There's a transportation disruption that's enormous. Ships are at sea in the wrong places. If they get to the ports, they're backed up, can't unload their goods. If they unload their goods, there aren't enough truckers to take them to where they need to go. A major problem. Now, what you were referring to a lot is the labor shortage. Yes, firms can't find workers. There's been an increase in demand, but workers are reluctant to come back into the workforce. So that's leading to shortages of workers. That's less production, less income being generated, and higher wages. Okay, so but there's one that's huge and that gets less incredibly big, and that's the increase in oil and natural gas prices. A typical supply shock. Natural gas prices are up 6-fold in Europe. They're up 2-fold in the US. Oil prices are up from below 50 to above 80. This is a big deal. So these kind of price increases, the electricity prices are going up, they have ramifications all over the economy. And we're kind of just beginning to feel the effects of that. So don't leave that out. That's really huge. Now, that has nothing to do with the Biden administration. Okay, that's negligible. Okay, what happens to the supply shocks? Will they persist into next year or not? Will be important. And inflation in 2022, it's such an interesting story, but I don't think we have time for that.
Oh, we might have time for it. I'm really interested in this topic as well. And so just following up on what Larry said, I think just one issue about measurement. I'm a bit frustrated at the moment with the typical way that they're now reporting the data in the business press and other places. Everything's year over year. And so it's inflation or the price index, like the CPI in August, I guess this is the one we just saw, compared to August of last year. But and normally that's fine. That's an okay way to deal with the natural seasonal fluctuations in these things. But as Larry points out, we are in the midst of an economy that's been hugely disrupted by the supply shocks, as he calls them. I would say most of them tied to the pandemic in one form or another, although there have been some other effects as well. This is real, certainly in my career, probably in almost anybody's recent economic history this is unprecedented, maybe even since, say, World War II, in terms of the amount of reallocation in the economy that's going. And so, lots of things can change in a year. What's my point about the year over year? Well, I was looking back at the data, someone anticipating this discussion today, and I was actually looking at the Fed's preferred measure, the personal consumption expenditure price index. And most of the big increases happened in, I think, December and early in 2021. That were the really big jumps. Now it's still high. It's still been going up higher than it had been, but lower in the last few months than it was earlier in the year. You don't really see that in the press. What probably will happen then is once we get far enough that those big jumps are out of the year over year, people say, oh, the inflation rate's falling. Well, it actually had been for a while. I see Larry maybe wants to comment on this before I go on. Yeah.
This cuts both ways. If you look at the broadest measure of underlying inflation, it's called the trim mean from the Dallas Fed. It takes out all the outliers, not only oil and energy prices, but all these other things that are just going up incredibly. And what they find is that that's 2% over the last 12 months. Over the last 3, 6, and 8 months, it's up 2.4 to 2.7%. That's this broadening effect that we're worried about. That's very troubling. And so we have to keep our eyes on that. I would just say what's amazing about this story is this. There's a tremendous disagreement about what inflation is going to be next year. The board staff thinks it's going to be below 2%. Pretty amazing. The participants think it's going to be modestly above 2%. And some reasonable forecasts are above 2.5%. We have two forces that are incredibly powerful: persistence and normalization. And people haven't given enough attention to normalization. So persistence is these supply shocks we'll talk about, they're not over, they're continuing. They're going to continue through the first half of next year. But the normalization story is, okay, will prices of those goods go up as fast next year as they did this year? If not, that's disinflationary. If they stabilize, powerfully disinflationary. But what goes up comes down. So we have some powerful disinflationary forces out there, and balancing these very, very difficult. I'm assuming low 2%, 2.2 inflation next year, but hey, it's just very little confidence in that story.
Well, I'm except for that last phrase, I'm very relaxed because my favorite forecaster just said inflation is going to be, kind of not so bad in 2022, at least, but with a lot of uncertainty. I would also say too, why do we care about inflation in some sense? And that's a big question, or maybe I should pose it as, what do we really care about in some broad sense? Now, there could be a sense of, well, it's kind of a cost of living issue, and if wages aren't keeping up, then I'm, as a household, I'm having a harder time, paying my bills. And I get that. If the gas prices go up a lot, it hurts the household in a relatively short period of time. But I think, especially when people will hearken back to, say, the 1970s, the bigger issue is a longer-term persistent rise in prices at a higher level. And one thing about these supply shocks are, the word shock in a sense makes the point. They might be big and they might be significant, but they tend to be kind of one-off things. And I think with so much of them being related to the pandemic, that most of the inflation that we're seeing right now is really a mishmash of lots of big changes in relative prices. Frankly, it's markets working. If it costs 4 or 5 times as much to ship a container across the Pacific Ocean as it did before the pandemic, well, that's going to lead to some higher prices. It's also going to lead to expansion of those resources if those high prices continue, which would tend to bring down their effect on inflation. So this reallocation process, I think, is critical here. It's less even about the kinds of things monetary policy is worried about, in my view, which is more that longer term persistence of price increases.
So that is very important. I should have said that at the beginning. The imbalance between aggregate supply and demand, that's about persistent inflation. Unless the Fed squeezes out, it's persistent inflation. Supply shocks are about a temporary burst of inflation. It's not an inflation shock, it's a price level shock. When you get from one price level to the other, it's gone. Along the way, you get a burst of inflation. So here's the problem. How long is temporary? That's the problem we're worried about. This question of persistence, is temporary longer than we expected? And what are the consequences of that going to be? And is it going to push the Fed to tighten earlier or raise rates earlier than they otherwise would?
Great. Professor Smith, any comments on that?
Obviously, inflation has political consequences, and the political consequences may feed back on the state of our economy. Republicans are already fully exploiting the inflation issue. Many speeches on the floor of the House and the Senate, political ads already on TV emphasizing inflation. And obviously a president who's somewhat anxious about the issue, choosing to have a press conference and make some comments about it already this week. And so we do have another issue. The president sees this largely, obviously, as a bottleneck issue and wants people to see it that way. The Republicans want everyone to see it as uncontrolled spending. And so we'll have another rhetorical battle over that. The numbers set the context. So I think the Democrats are anxious that that inflation number gets brought down sometime early in the next year.
I don't want to get into political things. One is right and one is wrong there. So, okay.
We figured that out, Larry.
But I think the story here is what's critical. If it turns out to be temporary and inflation is back to the low 2s next year, then the president will look like a genius. And the Republicans will say, oh, what happened? Okay, yeah. So we don't know. We don't know what the outcome is going to be. But if it is temporary and it dissipates next year, that's a plus for it takes an argument away from the Republicans, and it's a plus because after all, Biden has somewhat staked his reputation here on the fact it is temporary. Believe me, it is temporary.
And actually,
so is the Fed.
Every economic discussion that I've been part of since early March of 2020 is that it all depends on the COVID crisis in some ways, in terms of how that, how this plays out. If we get to this more normalization that we all hope is going to be the case with vaccinations and even the natural immunity that's moving forward and things along those lines, and the economy is more normal, it's going to take some time for it to settle out. Actually, I thought this was a really interesting point when I started the talk, but I guess it kind of does cut both ways. On the one hand, you could say, well, some of these disruptions will kind of work themselves out. On the other hand, you have maybe bigger demand, airline ticket prices going up, things along those lines. If people have decided to leave jobs in the restaurant industry and there's more demand for dining out and things along those lines, then you might get some additional inflationary pressure in the time as the crisis is receding, which of course will be good news across the board for our standards of living, our lifestyles, but could be a bit troublesome on the economic data as it works out. And that might not be done by midterm election time of 2022.
Absolutely. That's why there's this difference between below 2 and above 2.5.
Great. This is a perfect timing. We're going to move to our question portion. These are questions that were submitted when our attendees signed up. So we'll start with the first one. What are the implications of the Biden's plans for the U.S. national debt? Should concerns about government borrowing affect the outcome of these plans?
All right, Steve, you want to take that?
Well, I'll just say no. This is not a big concern. I know it's a big deal with at least in some of the public statements of Senator Manchin, who says that was concerned about the debt, and the Republicans, of course, are saying that it's going to lead to an expansion of debt. So two quick points, and we could talk more about this if people want to. But one is it's supposedly paid for. So we're all kind of rolling our eyes a little bit. Are the tax increases actually going to go through? Are some of them maybe overly optimistic in what's going on? But it seems pretty clear, as now looks to be the case with Obamacare, that it is a kind of close to balanced budget type of plan, in which case it has no particular implications for the national debt. You could say the tax increases could be damaging, but the debt issue is not there. Secondly, we've been worried about we've had big swings in the national debt for years and years and years, for decades and decades and decades. There have been, kinds of predictions that the sky is falling, that interest rates are going to go through the ceiling. I think that the debt to GDP ratio, which might be the most useful measure of the overall national debt, has gone from something like 30% in the 1990s to about 100% now, maybe a little over 100%. It's probably going to go up even more. Big swings. Interest rates are still very low. There's a lot of reasons for that, but I think that these concerns have been overblown, and I think the economics world is starting to recognize that in some ways. So even if this plan goes through with a substantial or tax increases falling non-trivially short of the spending, I think the effects on the debt are going to be reasonably small in that historical perspective. And even if it does rise, say the debt to GDP ratio rises, I think our recent history suggests that that's not going to be that big of a deal.
There's been a rethinking of the impact of deficits and debt on the economy. Traditional view is that increasing the debt to income ratio, raise real interest rates, undermine investment, and slow growth. That's the traditional story. It seems like that just hasn't happened. And so Larry Summers is one of those who's saying, we got to pull back from that a little bit. That's not what's been going on. We don't have to pay as much attention to it. Now, if the taxes pay for spending, then this is more or less off the table. If they don't, it's probably not a big deal. But probably is a big deal that we don't bring things under control sometime, because there is a debt sustainability problem out there lurking. It's been lurking. In 2010, I wrote a paper about the next crisis, and it was the fiscal crisis. And a client called me 5 minutes after it was posted. That's really the next crisis? Okay, he was really brilliant. The answer is no. And there'll be many, many more crises that we'll face before we face a debt crisis.
So let me ask it this way. Should the average American care about the national debt?
Shouldn't lose any sleep over it.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's a good answer. I think that, again, there's a lot of rethinking here in terms of what's going on. Right now, with the U.S. government can borrow at 30 years at a nominal interest rate of just over 2%, and that's up a ways. The debt maturity is much lower than that. I mean, much of the borrowing is a nominal interest rate, which is less than the inflation rate. In fact, that inflation we've been talking about, it tends to make the debt less burdensome. And I think ultimately that's the bigger issue here. I think the idea that somehow we're going to crowd out private investment, there just hasn't been any evidence for that, over this period of time. Ultimately we got to pay the interest on the debt, and that's a transfer payment. It's a sense of transfer payment from taxpayers to bondholders, if you like it that way. And I think there's a limit there. It's not that it can be, but I think that we've been overly concerned about this in the mainstream macroeconomics world over the last decade. So no, I don't think that the average person needs to lose any sleep over this.
Yeah, we do have to keep in mind that there are secular trends that are very powerful that have lowered real interest rates around the world. When I was at the Fed, we thought the real funds rate equilibrium was 2.5. Now it looks like it's 0.5. Okay, so that's why the government can borrow. Oh gosh, wouldn't it be great to borrow as much long-term debt, issue as much as long-term debt as you could, because it's going to be probably going to be a real bargain. But we face any debt issues in the context of very, very low interest rates. And while the debt has increased, interest burden on the debt really quite low as a share of the economy.
And of course, there is a statutory debt limit, which is a self-imposed limit. Obviously, Congress could do away with the debt limit and just allow spending and revenue decisions to determine what the annual deficit was and how the debt would grow. I'm curious about how my economist friends think about the debt limit, but we've got another mini crisis at least coming up in December because the Treasury has to continue to be able to borrow, and that borrowing ability will expire in December.
This is a very easy issue. No other country has a debt limit.
Yeah.
Why not? You pass the bills that are going to raise spending, et cetera, and raise the debt, and you pay for them. Okay? You don't have credit card debt, and when it's due, you say, no, I don't want to pay that. Okay? No, you can't do that. And this is silly. It's insane to have a debt limit. Now, some would like to remove it. Some feel otherwise, but it's silly, and it leads to these routine crises in the economy, and it makes other countries worried. You guys know what you're doing, okay?
Yeah, it really is silly. I mean, the economic perspective of this, there's political leverage to be gained here, and we've seen that play out in some ways. But there is no economic reason for this, and the idea that the U.S. government would ever default on dollar-denominated debt when it can create dollars is just kind of nuts. Given it's an obligation. And you can argue about whether we should have more or less debt and how it should be related to monetary policy. And there are a lot of interesting issues in all that. But should you pay the interest and principal on the outstanding debt? Of course you should. And there's no economic reason not to. If your household runs short of income and can't service its mortgage, well, you got a real problem there, and so does your bank. But you can't create dollars to pay your mortgage. What the U.S. federal government can't. Illinois or other states have an issue here, but it's not. The federal government should never default on its debt.
The government cannot print money to deal with its debt. Only the Fed can do that. Okay, so the government has to borrow. There's a long budget that says you either have to borrow or pay for it with money. They can't do that. So they have to pay for it by borrowing. That's the way the world works.
Yeah, we have a friendly disagreement on this one in the sense that at least the cooperate, let me put it this way. Maybe Larry and I can agree about it. The Fed and the Treasury can cooperate to deal with this issue. You hear about the $1 trillion coin. It's kind of silly. There's no economic reason it wouldn't work.
Well, the Fed and Treasury can cooperate in dealing with disruptions associated with the debt crisis. And I would say they don't cooperate in the sense that the government says, I got this big deficit, help me out. Okay.
So let me get to one last question here. So when the Fed begins to wind down its bond purchasing, which it feels like they've been doing for a long time, what effect will that have on interest rates and the stock market?
Well, what these bond purchases do is they tend to lower long-term rates relative to short-term rates. Short-term rates are at zero. That's the way you provide additional stimulus, and they work. Okay, as you taper and that goes away, then long-term rates will increase relative to short-term rates. That's not the really biggest story. The biggest story is liftoff. The biggest story, what happens when the Fed goes from 0 to, let's call it 2.5 or 3%. That's the biggest story.
Has the stock market factored in that already, that the Fed is going to will start easing this, or is it still yet to be seen? Unless
they've been in a closet all this time, everybody knows it. Everybody knows it. So there's no surprise here, no surprise at all. You would say when it's announced, let's say in November, it'd be a surprise if long-term rates moved more than a tenth. I don't know why they would move a tenth.
Yeah, it's a good point. I'll throw a little economic theory here into our conversation. Something called the expectations theory of the term structure, which sounds super technical, but it's a pretty straightforward idea. It says, what's the 10-year rate? Well, it's the expected 1-year rates compounded over 10 years. Because if it wasn't, then you could reproduce. You can make more money by holding the sequence of 1-year rates or holding 10 versus 1. So the financial markets are very, very efficient, and they deal with these kinds of things. So if we've got a 10-year rate now, which is about 1.6%, and a short-term rate, which is effectively 0, what's that telling you? That the expectations in the market are that eventually we'll get above 1.6%. So over the next 10 years, that we would average 1.6%. And so the bond market's got that. I mean, you can observe it. You can't really know for sure what people are thinking in the stock markets, but there would be no reason to think it's any different.
The expectations theory, as much as I love it, is incomplete, because long-term rates equal the expected future short-term rates plus a term premium. In principle, people don't like to hold long-term debt because of all the uncertainty. So you got to pay people, you got to incent them. You say, what can I do? I'm going to bribe you to hold long-term debt. What can I do? I can give you a little higher long-term rate than you would get with the short-term rate. Now that term premium itself has been incredibly compressed to 0 or negative, okay? So right now it looks like in equilibrium, the 10-year treasury rate might not be very different from the 3-month bill rate.
So we're not too worried, right, Larry, about this policy. Again, the Fed has been very, very effective at signaling this. There was the so-called taper tantrum back a ways that we were kind of working our way through some unusual monetary policy, but I think the financial markets have digested that. So
Absolutely.
I wouldn't, yeah.
Anybody who loses money over this deserves to.
All right. Well, we're up against our time today. So I'd like to thank Professor Fazzari, Dr. Meyer, and Professor Smith for sharing their expertise with us today. On behalf of the Elliott Society and the Brookings Partners, I want to thank all of our guests for joining us this afternoon. You'll be receiving a follow-up survey about the event. Your feedback is extremely helpful in ensuring we are providing programming that is relevant and timely. If you have suggestions for webinars, please let us know. We hope you enjoyed the program and look forward to seeing you at our next